Okay, good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on your time zone. Welcome back to the third week of NEW302. Today, well, when you're watching this, it will be what? The 24th. It's Thursday, the 24th of September. Okay, so today we're going to pick up a few threads from last week, ideally with considerably less, technical tripping up involved. I've got a couple of new setups, so I'm hoping to be able to elide that entire issue. Just steer right around it. That's the hope. So we're going to cover a bunch of things that we picked up last week. However, before we do that, I want to do some general bookkeeping stuff. So the first thing I wanted to mention, and I'll also post up announcements to this effect. You can watch it, but every channel to capture attention is a good one. So the first thing that I wanted to mention is that the Jungian Society election is going to be on Friday, tomorrow, at 3 p.m., I believe. For reference, I will post this announcement up so that you can see the relevant details, etc. The Jungian Society is a student group here at the University of Toronto and at New College specifically, which is involved with all things Jungian. I name-dropped them before. Full disclosure, I was a member of the Jungian Society back in the day. I was, in fact, I was the president of the Jungian Society for quite a while. So in that sense, perhaps my opinion is somewhat biased, but I will say that I think it's a terrific group. Of course, obviously, with every change of executive, the sort of internal flavor and interest of it changes, like the phoenix reborn from the ashes, which has often sort of rejuvenated things in really interesting ways. But I think the current group of executives is terrific. They're very dedicated, very into the material, very cool people. So yeah, if you're strongly interested in this material, and if you're interested in getting involved in student groupery, I would highly encourage you to get in contact with them. If nothing else, to join, but if you're interested in executive stuff, it can be very rewarding. I will say that I personally was never much of a joiner back in the day. I was not a big group identity person in my youth. But when I did come to university as an adult, I mean, you're adults too, but sorry, as a mature student, when I did come to university, I made the decision that I was going to sort of join up with this group. In fact, I made the decision I wanted to run it, but that's a different story. I made the decision I was going to join up with the group, and I have never regretted that decision. It formed a terrific basis to meet people socially who were, clever and like-minded and so on and so forth. So I met quite a few good friends through it. It provided a tremendous social base, which I have to admit, I'm not totally sure how that works under the current conditions, but perhaps forming a social base or contacting a social base is more important under the present conditions than it would even normally be. But it also gave me a lot of experience. So, I mean, I did have a life before I came to school, but among other things, it gave me the opportunity to put together a conference, which ended up being quite influential for me and for other people. Mind matters. So it gave me a lot of opportunities, and opportunities to work with university administration, opportunities to, frankly, play with the university's money to run events, which is always good. I did all kinds of cool stuff. I did a masquerade ball. I did art nights. We did pub nights. We did movie nights. We did lectures. Anyway, overall, it's a cool group. I would encourage you to take a look. So I will post their election announcement up in the announcements section, and hopefully you guys are interested, or if you're interested anyway, go check it out. Okay, second thing. The second announcement, which I'm going to post up in said announcements section, along obviously with the links to this, regards the choosing process for upcoming presentations, video presentations. Okay, so here's how this normally works. How this normally works is I use a randomizer, okay, on the names of all of the students who are still enrolled in the class, right, by this week. And I use that to generate a list. And then I call people up in class to make their selections about which day they're choosing. I can't do that here. I can't even reliably guarantee that, I'll get, like a full crop of people tonight. And the fact that it's asynchronous means, that it's an unreasonable expectation on my part, basically, to assume that everybody is going to clock in tonight, and therefore, to some extent, I would be playing favorites if I did it that way. Because traditionally, if you did not come to sign up when your name was called, boop-a-doo, you were at the bottom of the list, right? You would choose after everybody else chose. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is I'm going to spend a good chunk of today trying to come up with a fair and equitable way for you guys to select. I hate first come, first serve. I know that's how lots of things work, where it's like, okay, so now everybody rush. I hate this. I hate it in the class because it privileges, frankly, extroverts and people with a lot of physical size. And I'm reasonably capable of emulating extroversion, and I'm a pretty big guy, but nevertheless, empathy kicks in here. And I can see always that it is the case that when people make the mad rush, there are people who are not feeling like they're being treated fairly. So I don't like first come, first serve systems. That's why I have traditionally randomized things, which seems fair to me. It's kind of a lottery. But I think that will be interminably slow under these conditions. So it may be the case, I'm going to give it thought over the course of the day, but if I haven't come up with a better idea before 6 p.m. Tonight, then it may be the case that I will have to do something like that, which will be that I will set a prearranged time, which I will try to align reasonably with, enough time zones across the globe that everybody has a fair shot and nobody has to wake up at 2 in the morning to do it. But that it has enough time zones, alignment that, everybody, and I will say, look, doors open at this time. Here is the thread in the discussion board, and you're going to call it. Okay. And the idea is that you are calling a presentation for one of the weeks. Okay. And regarding the topic of that week. There is room to maneuver around your topic. Okay, you don't have to stick 100%. As I mentioned, I am a big proponent of creative presentation, et cetera, for this video presentation. So there's room to maneuver, but I don't want people to go sort of wildly off base, and I don't want to be doing things particularly out of order. So every year I get people who, in week 6 or something, want to do a highly advanced topic, and that won't work. It needs to be within the flow of the overall classroom. So if you're planning on going slightly off base and your topic is a more advanced one, you want a later date. Something I should mention in terms of date choosing, and I'll put this into. So you can do it. You can do this video presentation alone, or you can do it with a partner. As I already mentioned, if you do it with a partner, you share a grade, period. And it doesn't matter at some level whether or not your partner flakes out at you. So vet your choices carefully. Ask people, are you planning on staying in the course? Are you the sort of person who often, whatever? So that's something to bear in mind. Another thing to bear in mind, if this is the sort of thing that makes you nervous, is early presentations I'm going to tend to mark more charitably. So here's the reasoning for this. If you're presenting in the 3rd to last week of the year, right, you've got to have seen, it's a difficult tense, you saw everybody else's presentation, basically, right? You had the opportunity to observe what everybody did, what worked, what didn't. You have the benefit of absorbing the material for a much longer period of time and having worked on it hypothetically for a much longer period of time. The standards are higher. And that's just the way it is. Also, of course, the other people's work is forming, in some ways, the baseline standard against which your own performance is being measured. But what that means is that if you go earlier, it's lighter and more charitable, right? Because we haven't yet established a baseline, because we haven't had as long with the material, because you haven't had as many points of comparison. And traditionally, it'll be interesting to see how this rolls by video, but traditionally these presentations tend to be quite creative. People do really interesting creative things. Okay, somebody did ask a question, which I'll address now and also in the announcement, but somebody did ask me a question about, you know, sort of what the nature of class discussion or whatever is going to be, how this is going to work relative to your presentations. And the answer to that is, so you're going to do the video presentation, but you're also going to sort of lob out the discussion topics. You can send them to me and I will post them up, or, right? So the idea is that people will have watched your presentation and then you will throw up some discussion questions in the discussion board and foster discussion. So when I mean, you know, when I'm talking in the basic assignment description and stuff, and when I'm going forward about fostering class discussion, typically that would be an in-classroom situation. In this case, you're pre-delivering a 20-minute video that everybody can watch, right? And then the discussion questions are something that is happening online as per the discussion board. Discussion board, incidentally, should pick up a bit. I opted to give a second week to the intro thing to let people roll in, because I know sometimes it takes time for people to roll in. There's a critical mass effect that often kicks in where people are like, okay, enough people have responded, now I'm comfortable. So yeah, I'm going to put up the second topic, discussion topic today, and it'll sort of follow on some of the lecture material. Okay, so that's presentation stuff. So the answer is I will post up something today which outlines what the process is going to be. If I can't come up with anything better for the topic selection, like week selection, it's going to work like this. There will be a prearranged date, and it will be first come, first serve, rush the gates. Please note, if you partner with somebody, if either you or your partner signs up, then you get that slot, right? So you're signing up for one slot together, right? Okay. And again, that doesn't mean that your presentation has to be double length. You may note that I actually privilege, to some extent, people doing stuff in common, right? There's not more work required, so you get to split it between you. And there's a couple of reasons for that, some of which that will become more obvious. One is, it is its own kind of work to do work in partnership with somebody. Many people, myself included, work well with others, but better alone, right? So I'm often far happier puttering away by myself, right, where I am making the calls, right? Not that I don't enjoy group projects, I do. I mean, I didn't actually particularly like school group projects, with some exceptions. But the idea, you know, is that working with somebody else requires an entire set of skills, right? And also you're taking a risk because you're hitching your fate to the fate of someone else. So there isn't more work due from you. If you partner with somebody, it has some advantages, it has some disadvantages, and that seemed like a fair kind of balance. So unless I come up with something different, I will put up the announcement. The announcement will list a time, and at that time, bam, you may rush the gates. If it goes that way, I do apologize. It's not how I would have things be, but you know, so it is. We're all making concessions to the mighty pandemic. Okay, now let's get into the actual material at hand, announcements aside. Okay, so what did we do? Last week, we began to unpack some of the basic concepts around the unconscious, such as it is. Okay, and so one of the things that I was concerned with sort of underlining was this distinction between the unconscious and unconsciousness, right? And you might be saying, well, if the unconscious is parts of my mind which are outside of my consciousness and awareness, then isn't it unconscious? And the answer is, well, not quite, right? You know, my assumption is, this is a big assumption philosophically, but my assumption is, you know, a rock is unconscious. A rock is not thinking, I think. Anyway, a rock is not thinking. It's certainly not thinking my thoughts also, I think. Okay, and you know, there are, but the point is that these other aspects of my mind, and probably my brain, right, are thinking. They're just not thinking inside my awareness. They're going through processes, but that process isn't inside my awareness. That's the distinction. Inside and outside your conscious awareness, your ego. The whole point of the psychodynamic hypothesis, in a way, is that these things do think their own thoughts. They have their own drives. They have their own urges, right? They are, in some sense, beings which are not separate from you because that's an illusion, but they're separated out from your regular conscious ego much of the time and can be made contact with. Okay, so the idea of the unconscious. We talked a little bit about the Freudian iceberg model and a little bit about the hydraulic, right? Superego down, id up. And then I distinguish that a bit from the more living model of the psyche, which is proposed in Jung, which is a more dynamical kind of model, and it's an inherently developmental model. This is important, and we'll see why going forward. When I say that it's an inherently developmental model, what I mean is that, you know, it's sometimes said that Freud's claim for his particular form of psychoanalysis, his aim was to turn neurotic unhappiness into regular unhappiness, which, if it sounds a bit drear to you, I mean, don't get me wrong, regular unhappiness, I suppose, is better than neurotic unhappiness, but it's not what you would call, you know, not what you would call the high ring prize, right? Rather, okay, and you know, that conversion is this process of, bringing things to consciousness and so on and so forth, but it doesn't have quite the same developmental or transformative arc in a way. There is development, and you're looking to break through arrested stages of development in Freud, but yeah, it's not quite as developmental and quite as sort of alive as a system, right? It's that either that it's damaged and you undamage it, right, and thus allow things to proceed, or not. In Jung, on the other hand, you're dealing with a dynamical and living system, right? It's got living parts. And because it has living parts, those parts have their own goals, their own identities in an important sense. Because of that, the process of doing inner work, aside from being dynamical and alive and highly organic, is also inherently developmental. And in many ways, that development resembles, as much as anything, kind of a community development, right? So what is happening over time, as per the transcendent function, okay, which is a Jungian term for the aspect of ourselves that seeks to, right, transcendent function, it seeks to transcend our current formulations through synthesis. We'll get into that much more deeply when we're talking about the self and so on. Probably next week we'll get into it more deeply. But the point is that the transcendent function is looking to, right, to bring things into dialogue. Now, it's not true that everything in the psyche, it's like parts and then it's fusing together. And we'll touch on this later. Rather, what happens is that it's bringing it into relationship. And there's a metaphor that I like to use about proper relationship that we will touch on today. Okay, so Jung, in this sense, we dealt with the unconscious system, and then we particularly addressed, at least in an early form, the basic ideas of the collective unconscious, okay? And I talked a little bit about how the collective unconscious is formed of this sort of, you know, Jung's observations about this substrate of common humanity and why that's sort of a relevant factor. That's where we're gonna pick up. Oh, and I believe, like, right at the last, I shared this, right? Yes. Right at the last, I shared this, which is going to be something of our touchstone. Now, again, and I'm going to do this like every time until it drums into all of our minds. The map is not the territory. Okay, that's Count Korzybski for those who are keeping count. Korzybski. The map is not the territory. What do I mean? I mean that there are a bunch of different diagrammatic formulations of Jung's thinking which have their virtues in terms of, right, what they foreground and what they emphasize and whatever, but they also have drawbacks. One of those drawbacks with any of these diagrams is that they tend to present this material as though this is it. This, I assure you, is not it. And like, I really can't underline that too strongly, okay? It's not just that these relationships that you're seeing here are not as fixed as they appear. It's also that the various sort of components or entities that you're seeing listed here aren't exhaustive, okay? Now, some of you, right, are going to be, you're going to have relatively low ambiguity tolerance, and you're already going to be confused, and you're going to say to yourself, well, if you'll pardon the expression, for fuck's sake, like, well, why won't this stuff kind of gel? And it will. The answer is that it's much more useful at a certain level for us to start talking about these individual components, okay, and talk about the specific ways that they tend to relate to each other, okay, tend to relate to each other. I provide this map partly just because it gives people this quick and easy, like you're watching that, you could screen cap this, right? And then you theoretically have it in your notes. You could very rapidly jot it down. If you want to jot it down, you can jot it down. You could very rapidly jot it down, right? And this is going to provide you a certain amount of guideline. Now, you're already going to have come across diagrams like this one or different in the various readings, presuming that you are, in fact, some reasonable amount into the assigned readings. But I'm using this one as a bit of a touch point, and the reason, I think, will become clear as we proceed. Okay, so this is, to some extent, a Jungian map of the soul. We're not going to call it the Jungian map of the soul because there's no such thing. But this is one we're going to use for the time being so that we can sort of elucidate some of these structures within the psyche and talk a little bit about their functions within the Jungian system. Okay, so with that in mind. Before we get into that, though, there's one other sort of major piece that needs to be addressed. And again, this is the kind of thing we're going to come back to in a round, but I want to try to give you some basic groundwork in it first, because it is a concept that confuses people. So this is the concept of the archetype. Now, what we're in fact going to talk about here is the archetype, the archetypal image, and the complex. The archetype, the archetypal image, and the complex, okay? Those three things are related and they're easy to confuse with each other. I'm gonna try to give you some quick distinctions so that you can sort of break them apart in your mind. They often get used interchangeably, right? Sometimes erroneously, and sometimes by Jung himself, which is a little maddening, right? So sometimes he uses the terms semi-interchangeably, and that also depends where in your writing over the time you are. But eventually, the archetype, the archetypal image, and the complex are distinguished. And so it's useful to talk about these things. Okay, so let's start with the archetype. Archetypes. So when we're talking about the structure of Jung's unconscious and collective unconscious, right? The archetypes are sort of, in a sense, what correspond, right? If you think about the Freudian model and you're like, oh yeah, the superego and the id. The superego and the id are these centers, right? These independent centers of action and a form of consciousness, basically, within the mind, right? So the ego is its own center, its conscious center, the one that you identify with. But the superego and the id are doing their own thing, right? They clearly have a view of how things are. They have their own modes of action. They have ways of exerting that ability through libido, right? And libido, we now think of libido as sex energy, right? That's the way that we typically use it. But libido, somewhat in the Freudian sense, right, but definitely in the Jungian sense, gets used to mean sort of energy in the general sense. So don't think of libido as just being sort of sexual drive energy. Libido, within most of the discussions we'll be having, will refer to just the general energy that's powering the psyche, right? So if things have libido, they're animated, right? To be honest, I tend not to use the term personally that much, just because people find it confusing, right? And so I tend to speak about energy and energetics, and people, for whatever reason, get that, despite the fact it's very vague terminology. But it's in many ways less confusing than saying libido, but for reference, okay? So the point is, right, in the Freudian system, you've got your ego, and that's the thing you recognize as yourself, typically, and then you've got superego and you've got id. The Jungian system is more complicated than that, right? There are more parts, right? More relationships out there, more ways in which the system is differentiated away from your ego. But those different parts, ultimately speaking, constellate around archetypes. Okay, so what are archetypes? Okay, so we already talked about, and I'm pretty sure it didn't get erased. Did it get erased? I lost track. 4 recordings last week. Anyway, we talked a bit about sort of a biological basis right, for archetype in some sense. I think we talked about this. If we didn't, scream at me and I'll re-record it. So just let me know, and then I'll re-record it. So we talked about biological basis for archetype, which is things like, up, down, left, right, these cultural universal pieces. And we talked to some extent about like the spider image, right? So, that human babies react to spiders, right? Okay. And so, considering for a moment what that means, that it's a shape in the world that elicits a specific emotional reaction, a specific response. It elicits action, it elicits emotion, and it's a specific form, okay? So think about those things for a second when you're thinking about archetype. Okay, likewise, I don't think I did do this one. I think I did it in office hours. Okay, it's useful to consider the idea of imprinting, okay, in this respect. Okay, so what's imprinting? So in developmental science, developmental psychology, there's this concept of imprinting that you often see in the animal world, but we are not apart significantly from the animal world. Okay, so here's a good example. When a goose lays goose eggs and they hatch, the small fuzzy birdling which emerges is called a gosling. Right? Now, if you've ever seen a goose or a duck, right, where the mother goose or the mother duck is walking through the park, you might see them in the spring walking with a line of cute little birds after them, right? And the one is walking and the others are following behind, single file in a line, right? And why do they do this? They do this because they are small and easy to gobble up, relatively defenseless, and this is a pretty good survival strategy, right? Okay, so the answer is, where do they learn this, right? Or the question rather is, where do they learn this? And the answer is, they don't. It's an imprinting thing. So what do I mean? I mean that provided that when the egg hatches, okay, the moment that the egg hatches, the gosling will blink, and every animal but us can get things done pretty early. So the gosling will poke its head out and blink, and it will look for the mother goose, right? Who will probably be an early object that they will set their eyes on that, meets this criteria. And then they will imprint on the mother goose, right? After that, they will behave in this way towards the mother goose. They will toddle in a line after the goose, right? The goslings will follow in this line. Well, how do we know that this is a question of imprinting? And the answer is because if you intervene experimentally, you can get a newly hatched gosling to imprint on a shockingly wide variety of things, okay? So, if you got a hand puppet, you can get it to imprint on a hand puppet. You, a researcher with a lab coat, this all seems kind of unethical to me, but anyway, you, the researcher with a lab coat, can be there, they'll imprint on you. You can get them to imprint on a ping pong ball, like a small white spherical ping pong ball or a tennis ball, fuzzy yellow. And if you do that, you take a tennis ball, fuzzy yellow, and you get them to imprint on that, and then they get out of their egg, right? And you roll that tennis ball across the table, all the goslings will follow after it. They will treat it in terms of their action and their emotion in the same way as they would treat the mother, who under sort of typical conditions, you would assume that's what they were imprinting, right? The mother is there, she's warming the nest, they hatch, there's the mother, they imprint, okay? Okay, so you can get them to imprint on all kinds of things if you substitute something else for what would typically be there in that moment of sensitivity, right? In that imprinting moment, that developmental receptivity, okay? So think for a second about, broadly speaking, and this is metaphorical, but think broadly about what this means. What it means is that there's a kind of hole, okay, in the mind of a newborn gosling. There's a hole. And the hole is sort of timed, okay? It's situational, but it's timed. It's like when you emerge, you're going to see an object, and it has to meet, certain minimum criteria. You can't get a gosling to imprint on anything at all, but it's shockingly broad. And so it's like, okay, at this time, you're going to look around, and typically, the object that you're going to encounter first is going to be the mother goose because she will have been overseeing, right? But there's this hole. And the hole is like, okay, and then whatever you find, that's what you're going to fill the hole with. Right? That's what you're going to fill the hole with. Okay, so there are other forms of imprinting. So one that we see cross species, including it seems in humans, is sort of imprinting on sexual preference. So if certain kinds of events happen during sort of crucial stages of development, right, then animals or people will develop sort of atypical sexual drive, sexual interest, right? So for instance, there are certain kinds of parasexual behaviors that have been linked to sort of developmental imprint stuff, at least in a large number of cases. I don't want to overgeneralize, but it seems like it happens pretty often. So for instance, people who develop a really strong interest in feet or shoes, sexually speaking, often will have some kind of particular moment at a crucial kind of developmental thing that really like snaps this into place. People who have really strong locked tastes in a lot of way, often that traces back too. They're like, oh yeah, this is the type, and it all traces to this person, right? With geese, we also see this. So there was a case a few years ago where this farmer was having his other animals basically harassed by this goose. This goose would come in and harass them, and they would chase it off and whatever. And then somebody finally noticed that this goose that was harassing them appeared to be harassing them in a very friendly fashion. And somebody was like, well, why is this goose trying to mate with cows, right? Anyway, finally, they figured this out, that this goose was actually from this farm. See, the geese would fly away and come back and whatever, but this goose had actually been raised among the cows. And so the basic idea was, oh, at some point this goose sexually imprinted on cows, right? And so every time, the spring drive starts to rev up and it flies home, it's like, oh, I got to come back. Thank God, cows, right? Okay. At this point, you're probably chucking to yourself because, it's a curious idea. Although it tells you a lot, frankly, about the fluidity of sexuality, and we'll come back around to that. However, nevertheless, right, the idea is there is a whole, in a sense, that is waiting to receive material within the mind of the goose, okay? And at the right time, whatever comes to fill that sort of receptacle in the mind ends up forming the basic structure of a pattern of emotion and action. Okay, how does this relate? We can think about, oh, right, guinea pigs are excited with this idea, apparently. Okay, I'm sure that came through on the tape. Okay, so how can we think about this? Okay, so I mentioned archetype, archetypal image, right, and complex. One easy way to think about this that I think is quite useful is think about the archetype as the whole, okay? The archetype is the whole. Why? It's the organizing principle within the mind. Now, there are some versions of archetypes that you're going to find within the literature, including Jung's, that are going to talk about the archetypes as less of a biological principle and more of a cosmic principle, okay? And it's true. There is a phase in his work where he starts getting into that, but don't worry about that yet. It's just complicated. First, think about it as a biological principle, like a reflex, which was how his early comparisons, in fact, often, guinea pigs sound a little like water whistles. They're fascinating creatures. I thought that when we got them, I thought that they would be sort of boring like lagomorphs, like rabbits. So rabbits are lagomorphs and they have like no expression at all, but they're not at all. They're very expressive. They do, happy hops. They have very clear moods and expressions, quite a bit of personality, and they're extremely vocal, and indeed vocal in the sense that like, there are certain kinds of music and things that they like, which I wouldn't have expected of an animal of that size. For reference sake, it seems that our particular guinea pigs are a big fan of the band Metric for whatever reason. I don't know if it's Emily Haynes' high-pitched voice, but every time I got Metric on, they like that, so go figure. Okay, so archetype, archetypal image complex. So you can think about the archetype as the whole, the receiving whole. It's the pre-existing structure waiting to organize emotion and action, waiting to organize emotional response and behavior, right? It's the whole. Okay, now the culture, because we're mostly talking about humans, forms the archetypal image, okay? The culture is the material that tends to form the archetypal image, right? So in a sense, it's the common environmental image around such a thing, okay? And then your complex is your personal material. And everybody has a complex, okay, for every archetype. But normally, when we talk about these things, we only really mostly talk about your complex if it's being problematic. I mean, that's basically how it is. So the shorthand that I often use with my clients is, it's only a problem if it's a problem, right? There aren't behaviors out there that are sort of, in my opinion, intrinsic problematic mental illness. It's a problem if it's a problem. If you have a particular strain, and I think that I'm sympathetic to neurodiversity in this sense, right? Although sometimes I think that, like most movements, that movement can go a little bit far, sort of in not modulating things. But for the most part, I tend to agree with it, which is the idea that, like, there is no normal. There's no single style of cognition. There's no personality that is the good one. There is no, right? There's no one way to be that is best or better. That's not true. It's not true. It's situational, and in fact, there are mathematical proofs for this, but this isn't the course for that. I won't do that here. So, but for reference, the no free lunch hypothesis, the no free lunch theorem, right? So anyway, yeah, the point is that there's no best one or good one or whatever. However, some things are maladaptive, right? And when I say that they're maladaptive, I mean that whatever the particular, behavior or whatever is, whatever the propensity is, it causes more problems for people than it solves, and it causes them emotional distress, right? That's the benchmark that I would typically use in my own therapeutic work. It's only a problem if it's a problem. So as an example, right, people may have some difficulty around substance use. And it's like, it's always got to come down, it's only a problem if it's a problem. This also, I add, serves the double function of, if people don't think it's a problem, they're not going to work on it anyway. So it doesn't matter. People only want to work on the things that they actually think are problems. And they only know that they're problems when they start blowing up in their face to a significant extent that they're like, oh my God, I need to do something. Like, I got to get on top of this somehow. Right. Okay. So when we're talking about complexes, usually that's kind of what we mean. We mean a complex insofar as it's a psychological formation that's a problem, that's causing problems, that then needs to be worked with in order to facilitate, growth or freeing out difficulties. Okay, so archetype, archetypal image, complex. So the archetype is like the whole. The archetypal image is like the cultural association. So let's move from geese for a second to mothers in humans. Okay, human mothers rather than geese mom. Goose mom. That barely sounds like a word. Okay, so what do I mean? What do I mean here? Yes, every goose, not every, but I assume most sort of genetically typical geese are going to have this hole in their psyche that's going to be ready for an imprint from the mother goose at a particular moment, after which they will, in accordance with survival, follow after. They will have a pattern of feeling, right? Attraction, whatever, probably some amount of love, and a pattern of action they will follow. They will stay within range of, right? Okay, for the mother goose. Ditto in humans. So first off, everybody in the class, everybody on Earth has a mother. Period. A biological mother. Okay? Now, you might not know your biological mother. You may not have been raised by your biological mother. You may not have a good relationship or a strong relationship with your biological mother, but you had one. Guaranteed. There is, as yet, nobody on Earth who has been created without the sort of involvement of biological mother, right? You also have a biological father, but you'll notice that that's a somewhat more removed figure, right? In theory, a biological father can just contribute genetic material and never be present again. And so that changes the way that particular, right, archetype is going to operate. And we'll come back around to that. But for the mother, the operating assumption here is, right, that odds are you gestated inside your biological mother's uterus for give or take 9 months, and then you were born, and then depending, right? It's possible that you were adopted. It's possible that whatever, lots of things are possible. But sort of in terms of typicality, the odds are, right, statistically, that what happened was you were born, you were then close to your mother, you breastfed, likely not, that's not a given, but statistically, right, that you breastfed, et cetera, and that your mother cared for you quite closely for the first couple of years. Because of that basic assumption, you too have an archetypal receiving hole in your psyche that waits for something called mother. Now, when we talk about the archetypal image, we're talking in part about different cultures' takes on motherdom, because we're more sophisticated than geese. So what we're talking about here is, it's not just a question of a certain amount of emotional whatever, and right, babies do. They emotionally, they intrinsically orient towards the mother, they intrinsically orient towards her voice, they intrinsically, right, look to suckle. Like all that stuff is instinctive, right? It's sort of built in. You don't have to teach babies. I mean, typically you actually do have to teach them a little bit, but they have the impulse to latch to the nipple right away. You know, and there are a bunch of these things. And babies got some good programming. For instance, babies don't typically smile right away. And a good friend of mine once said that babies have this down to a science, right? Because just when your baby is like just about ready to, you know, you're frustrated, very frustrated with the baby's disruption of your sleep, with the baby's screeching, with the baby's whatever, and you're just about ready to throttle the baby and chuck it in the river. That is the moment when the baby will first make proper eye contact and smile at you, basically. And then, of course, all is forgiven and it melts away because we are hardwired to have that response, right? We also have a whole relative to baby. Anyway, we'll get to that. So, but the point is that, you know, babies have this sophisticated set of things. But for humans, that tends to go well past where it does for geese. So we have this hole for mother, but the hole for mother isn't just going to be filled with basic biological orientation. It's going to also be filled with cultural material. Cultural material, right? Where cultural material means what are our cultural expectations about motherhood. And that will be derived from our stories, from our mythology, right? From cultural examples of what constitutes a mother, right? What's a mother? What should a mother be? What does a mother do? What, right? This comes out of our stories, comes out of our myths, it comes out of our legends, right? This idea, right? The mother gods will tend to carry a certain amount of that. So there's cultural material there about what mothers do and how mothers behave. And that material is going to vary culture to culture in its specific expression, okay? And so there we get sort of archetypal image. It's the accumulation of cultural material, right? Which then is going to form the environment that's likely to fill this, right? And at the very least, if that isn't the material that gets inside the receiving hole, as it were, right? It's nevertheless going to be in dialogue with it, right? Because even if you get something other than that, then what you're doing is feeling like you don't match up against the image, right? In some important sense. Okay, and then the specifics, what you actually get, that's your complex. And that could be just fine. Typically people have some complexes that are problematic, which is to say that they're sort of either not aligned with norms in some way, or they're not aligned with the rest of their psyche in some way, or they're, you know, at odds with the ego in a powerful fashion. And when we get to talking about it, we'll talk a little bit about sort of dissociative mechanics and dissociation and how that stuff works. But the point is that the complex is your personal material, and typically it's only a problem if it's a problem. Okay, so you all have a mother, you all have this whole waiting, and so every human being has some idea, right, within typical ranges about motherhood. And that might be full of your biological mother, right? It might be full of some amalgam of your biological mother and, say, an adopted mother, right? Or if you were raised by a grandparent or an aunt or something, right? But there's going to be a bunch of female material, generally speaking. In some cases, right, it could be a father or another male figure, but generally speaking, it's going to be female. And we tend to have a cultural bent in that direction. The point is that even if you've never met your mother, let's, you know, in the case that you were born and immediately put up for adoption and, right, you're still going to have material there. You're still going to have material there. And it will be composed in some sense of whoever it is that did raise you will form some of that, right? Some of that impulse. And then some of it will be formed with speculation, imagination, basically. So this is somewhat more common, I would say, for sort of the father archetype and father complex, just because, as I mentioned, it's statistically speaking more common, right, for fathers to be absentee, right? People do not always know their fathers. And, you know, since pregnancy is largely, right, the female, you know, issue, it's not largely, it's entirely these days. Man, we're not seahorses. In seahorses, the male gives birth. Anyway, we're not seahorses. So, you know, let's face it, the number of cases where men contribute their genetic material and then they're out, it's non-zero, right? Also, obviously, there are cases where, the father might die or be injured or be whatever. The point is, it's more possible, right, that would be the case. And it's much, much more often that women are the primary caregivers and therefore that mothers are the primary caregivers. As such, it's relatively common for people to fill, right, their complex with imaginal material around their fathers. Adopted kids, and I know lots of adopted kids, I've worked with lots of adopted kids, often have very charged material around this, right? And in some ways for obvious reasons. I mean, when you're adopted, even if you're adopted into an extremely loving home, it does raise questions about your biological parents, right? Now, some people will say never think about it, whatever, and that probably means that they have strong emotional bonds, strong ties, right, to their adopted family. But when they say never think about it, I typically doubt that. The reason, and I don't push on it because it doesn't need to be pushy, but, you know, the speculative faculties of children, right, are very strong. Kids think about things and they come up with ideas and theories, right? And lots of adults, for some reason, lose connection with their childhood for a reason. This is something we'll talk about actually at enormous length later. I find it a very puzzling phenomenon. I remember my childhood reasonably well and don't have trouble making contact with either sort of my childhood self or children. I connect with children quite readily. Yeah, so, but the point is, it's like kids speculate, right? So when things happen, if kids don't have a grown-up explanation, that doesn't stop them from speculating. They still speculate, and the theories that they come up with. And of course, then kids are going to speculate. If they don't have a biological father on the scene, they're going to speculate about it. If you think about this, you've probably seen versions of this in fiction, right? This is where kids will formulate a version of a father who is a distant but powerful or wealthy or beneficent figure. My father is off, da 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 da. And a lot of this is confabulation, and the degree to which kids believe it can vary pretty heavily. The same thing obviously can go for other figures if you don't have them. If you have this hole waiting for material, and then the material is not forthcoming from the environment, the imagination will start to fill in the gaps. The same thing, or similar, not the same, but similar sorts of things can happen when the developmental progression of, right, this sequence from archetypal image complex is interrupted by certain things. So, interestingly, if somebody has a parent who dies at a certain age, that often will freeze the development of the material in that particular area, and that can lead to problematic complexes. But a lot of the time, it can make it difficult for people to progress their own developmental relationship with that figure. And your developmental relationship with your parents changes over time, or it should. And we'll talk about that too, because it's a major cause. When I became a full-time therapist, I think I joked sometime in the first 3 months, I was like, oh my God, Freud was right. It's always the parents. And that's not totally true, but the number of times in which there are sort of motivating issues with parents that have to do with a failure of the relationship to update or a weird power dynamic. Anyway, we'll talk about that. We got whole weeks to talk about parents, let me tell you. And I basically guarantee you that stuff will connect with you because I seldom encounter anybody that doesn't connect with. Okay, but the point is, like, a death can arrest that process in certain kinds of ways, such that people have a hard time developmentally updating, right, their complex, moving it through stages, and then it can become problematic even if it wasn't. Okay, so archetype, archetypal image, complex. Receiving whole, so this is the tendency, the structure, okay? Cultural material, right? Personal formation. Okay, so hopefully that helps clarify things. There's more to say about this, but I want to give you guys, like I said, sort of initial handles to grab onto. Okay, so it's interesting to note when we're talking about the archetype. I mean, we're talking here about familial archetypes, but there are other kinds of archetypal influences, obviously, that exist cross-culturally. So like every culture, every human culture, has a concept of the warrior, right? The warrior, the fighter, the soldier, right? This idea of somebody who fights, somebody who fights, right? And not just a brawler, that's not quite the same thing, but somebody who fights socially on behalf of your society, right? That is a cultural universal. It may be a very distributed idea, but the point is every culture has one. Therefore, since every culture has one, every culture has material around it, right? What any given culture thinks about, right? And their associations with and their mythological material around what a warrior is going to influence their particular archetypal image, right? You'll often see it in the form of the god, of their god. So if they're warrior gods or warrior figures, that will often carry the archetypal image in a certain sense. And then you'll get the particular complex, right? The unique craft that accumulates around this with an individual. Okay. So, and there are all kinds, we'll talk about a bunch, but you know, the trickster, right? That's a famous one, archetype, archetypal image, complex, right? So it's an archetype, everybody has some notion of the trickster, right? Of jokiness, of disruption, of whatever, okay? And we'll get into this, but archetypes, every archetype can be good or bad. Every archetype can be good or bad. So a trickster, okay? We all know basically the trickster, you know, plays jokes, plays pranks, you know, takes the air, tends to disrupt excessive order, right? But the trickster can be good or bad. It's actually largely contextual, as most of these things you'll find are. So Bugs Bunny is a good trickster. Why? Because he kind of takes the air out of overinflated culture figures, right? And is irrepressible, right? He's also quite gender bending, which I think is an interesting and common feature of the trickster, right? So for some reason, periodically, he'll go into his like female Bugs Bunny mode with the dress and the stuff, and that often plays a part of it. So he's category, right? He moves through categories. He's intercategorical. Okay, that's the trickster. He's a very positive kind of trickster. The Joker, on the other hand, tends to be a relatively negative kind of trickster. But you'll note that he has most of the same traits. So if you think about Heath Ledger's performance in The Dark Knight, right? Nolan's The Dark Knight, you know, you'll see these same traits. It's like he's jokey, he's pranky, he's, although in a particularly kind of malevolent and homicidal way, right? He's jokey, he's pranky, he's looking to disrupt order, and he's looking to sort of take the piss, right? To let the air out of overinflated, overstuffed figures. And I add, he's gender bendy a little bit, right? You remember that sequence where he dresses up as the nun immediately before he comically and then explodes the hospital? Okay. So the point is, it's the same kind of figure, but inflected negatively. Every culture's got a trickster figure. Every culture's got a warrior figure. Every culture's got a trickster figure. Every culture has its own idea of what it means to be wise, and actually there's a high degree of correspondence. We'll talk a little bit about that. But every culture has its own idea about the wise person, right? The wise old man, the wise old woman, right? Every culture has some idea about magic, even if, you know, the culture sort of as a whole, like ours, is like, we don't believe in that. We don't believe that, don't we? Okay. I think you'll find that, you know, as much as our culture sort of elevates the scientific method and claims that they don't believe in magic, that people behave in fashions that indicate they do believe in magic quite routinely. So yeah, the concept of magic, right, is a cultural universal. And the list goes on and on. And if you consider that map, you can also look at those things as archetypes, and you will see how your specific complexes interface. So the key thing that I wanted to get at here was, right, the archetype, this inherited, shared, collective biological propensity, right, that is waiting for specifics, right? But it doesn't wait with no selectivity, if that makes sense, right? The whole doesn't respond to everything and anything, right? There are some timing conditions typically, but also like certain kinds of things will fit. It's waiting for certain kinds of things, but it will accept a wide variety. And so, you know, with mother, you know, you've got a biological opening for mother, right? You've got the cultural material, which is informing what mothers in the environment usually are behaving like and what people think a mother ought to behave like, and so on and so forth, right? That kind of material around it. And you've got then what you personally, individually imprint in that moment. And the same goes for all these other things, your ideas about, right, how these different structuring components. And you'll notice, okay, and I sort of saved this to last because I wanted to give the hands-on stuff. Jung, philosophically speaking, exists at the intersection of Kant and Hegel. Okay, there are other influences, but Kant and Hegel are powerful. Okay, Kant, you know, introduces to us a bunch of things, right? But one of them is Kantian categories, right? That these categories that we impose on the world to structure the world in some important sense, and that the categories, you know, are sort of things in themselves, as they say, right? So the idea being that, like, you can't ever know the thing in itself. You can only know kind of the presentation of it in your mind or whatever, but you can never get to the thing, okay? Lots of you will have had this thought, generally, philosophically speaking, about things like, oh my God, I'll never really see, you know, this. I'll never really see this. All I'll ever see is the light rays bouncing off of it, and like I can never get to the actual fundamental thing, and so on and so forth. We'll talk a bit about that because there are some ideas that say that that's true and some that say that they're not. But the point is, for Jung, right, as a Kantian, he's really getting at this. And the archetypes are very much like Kantian categories, right? They structure the world. They structure your perception of the world to make it sort of understandable and navigable, right? So they structure your perception of the world and your perception of yourself. They structure you, they structure your experience. And also, you can't ever get at them. You can never experience the archetype in and of itself, the archetype. You can't ever experience the whole. You can only experience, right, the archetypal image in your complex, period. You can only experience the archetypal image in the complex. A metaphor that I sometimes use here, okay? So if you consider that the archetype is a bit like, if you've ever done this experiment, you know, you like take a magnet and put it under paper, like a bar magnet. So now you can no longer see the magnet. And then you take powdered iron filings, and you scatter them onto the page. And as you do so, you'll find that they fall in this sort of beautiful butterfly-like pattern around the magnetic field, right? Okay, because they're being influenced by something you cannot see. That is very similar to the kind of idea we're dealing with here. In a sense, you can never see the archetype. You can never see the archetype. You can only sense it by the influence that it has on the way that it organizes material that you can see, right? So, you know, in a sense, the archetype is there within your mind and has sort of a field, an organizing pattern that it's using to organize incoming information around itself, right? Like the magnet has the invisible field, but you can't ever see that. All you can see is, as the iron filings fall and arrange themselves around the magnet, you can make out the field, right? You can make out the shape of the field, but you can never see the magnetic field. You can just sort of see its form, its shape, right, around the magnet by introducing material. In the same way, you can never see the archetype. But what you can do is you can look at archetypal image and complex, and from that you can see the commonalities in the structure, right? You can sort of see the structure because of what sticks, like what sticks in place, how it organizes things, okay? Okay, so that, I hope, is a bit of an overview. The Hegel part, you're like, but you didn't talk about Hegel. And it's like, because we're talking about synthesis. We'll get into that a bit next week. But it's an important thing to remember. Okay, so this is the basic overview that I wanted to get into. So now for this next piece, right? For this next piece, we can return to this fine map, which I probably won't actually use in the next lecture. So you should remember this, because I'll obviously be free talking a bit, and I hate being a little postage stamp in the corner. Okay, but that should give you an idea. The next thing that we're going to talk about is all of these various structures that exist within the Jungian notion of the psyche. Okay, starting with the ego, what you typically identify as yourself, and then moving out into all these other pieces. Good. Okay, so that's for the next video.